Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Craig Farrell. I'm the Executive Director of the West Bend Area Chamber of Commerce. We've been holding supply chain breakfasts every spring and fall for, I guess, about the past 5 years, and they really have been focused primarily on manufacturers and those that support manufacturing, and have had a whole list of different topics. But this time we're opening up really to a much larger part of our membership, and we're doing that in order to really educate our businesses on something that is really a cancer within the state of Wisconsin. The dark store loophole has been going on now for several years, and most people really don't have an understanding of what it's all about. What does it mean? How does it affect them? Well, what they don't know is that it can affect them in the pocketbook. So I brought together a really illustrious panel today to talk on the subject from a state level, from a county level, from a really a local level where kind of the rubber meets the road. And today I have Senator Dewey Strobel, Mayor Craig Sedonico, and Representative Rick Gundrum. And they'll be talking about it from their perspectives, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions. I'm going to ask a few questions kind of to get it going, but if you are interested in asking a question, Jill will have some index cards. You can certainly fill out a card, I'll get it, and I'll ask the question for you. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing Senator Dewey Strobel.
An interesting one because it's both very simple but also very complicated when you go into the weeds. And the simple aspect is, as what Craig indicated, that what's going on in this situation is there's a tax shift. One group of real estate taxpayers ultimately pays less, and another one pays more. That's kind of on the very high level, simplistic way to look at this situation here. But really, how we assess properties is how we tax our properties. So we all get real estate tax bills, and the basis of that tax bill is the assessment that each property has. That's the valuation, and based upon that valuation is how you determine how much taxes are paid on that piece of real estate. So there's three ways that value is determined on a piece of real estate. There's the income approach, there's the cost approach, and there's the market comparable approach, those three methods. And really appraisal, or determining, that's what you call, when you do an appraisal, that's how you determine the fair market value, which by definition in the state of Wisconsin, the fair market value is supposed to be the assessed value on your tax bill. And those are the three methods that are used for all different types of real estate. Now, for certain types of real estate, one of those methods is probably more appropriate than the other. Like on a single-family home where you have very comparable type properties and they sell for a specific use to be lived in. There's no income component to them whatsoever. Really, the market comparable approach is really the most logical one for that. For your home, when it sells, you look to maybe a home down the street, and you can draw comparisons between the values of two different homes. And when an appraiser is making an appraisal, or thus determining market value, or thus determining what an assessment would be, there's adjustments made so that you can come up with an equal value, at least as it relates to the two different properties. Now, with income properties, it's different, because income properties, it's not a commodity as much as it is a single-family home, but just by their nature, when it's a income property, there's income involved. It's a rental property. It rents for a certain amount of money. And in the marketplace, the free market, properties are sold on the basis of, when it's an income property, on the basis of its income generating ability. So that's how you determine the value of that property. You look at that income, and it would be an arm's length transaction between a knowing buyer and seller, and the price that they arrive at would be the value of that property on the base, and that investor is buying it on the basis of the income stream that it creates, i.e. the rents that property generates. Now, we're not talking about the income of a business that happens to be in it. Has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with, if that property is sold from an individual A to individual B and there's a lease on that property, that person, individual B, now will receive the benefit, the cash flow of that lease over the period of the term of that lease. So that's the basis of how an income property is valued. And we have income properties all over the place, and they come in really all different shapes and forms. Retail buildings, commercial buildings, industrial buildings, they all can and oftentimes are income properties. But the problem happened in 2008. Everything was fine in the state of Wisconsin until 2008, when some very smart attorneys convinced a court in the state of Wisconsin that our statutes weren't written clearly enough that income could be considered in the valuation of a piece of real estate. Now, as crazy as that sounds, if the statutes aren't clear, and that's what these attorneys happen to convince our courts of, that income cannot be considered in the valuation of property. Where does that leave you with an income property? When an income property sells on the basis of its income, but yet when you need to assess that property for tax purposes, you cannot look at the income that it generates. It just makes no sense whatsoever. So where the loophole component comes in, and it's really started out with a lot of the big box stores, where they look at the empty Kmart or the empty, you name it, big old retail store, and they'll say, hey, and they're the Meijer or the Menard or the Walgreens or you name it. I don't want to pick on anybody too much, but those kind of stores oftentimes are typical of the ones who do it. They'll say, hey, my building, it's got 50,000 square foot. It's got tilt-up construction. It's on 8 acres. It's the same as that building down the way there. And since you can't look at the income of my property, the only thing you can look at is how much that property sold for down the street, that vacant Kmart that now is a go-kart track or a church or something like that isn't really considered a highest and best use. So that's how those types of sales comparables, and not income, but sales comparables, are being used in that instance to value these properties. And the irony of it is, these owners can come in one day and they'll say, hey, Mr. Assessor, here's what my property's worth. It's worth $1.3 million because that vacant Kmart down the road sold for $900,000 3 months ago. And then then the very next day, they can sell that property to an investor based upon the income of the lease attributable to that piece of real estate. They can sell that to an investor for $5-6 million. And that one would assume that would be the fair market value of that property, right? But then they can turn right around, go to the assessor and say, hey, you may think that's the fair market value, but according to the law of the land in the state of Wisconsin now, you can't look at income. That property sold on the basis of the income it generates. You can only look at market comparables. So even though I just sold that property for $5 million, sorry, it's got to be valued based upon the market comparable sale of that vacant Kmart down the road of $1 million. So that's what's going on. And now, I'm the last guy in the world who wants to talk about raising taxes. I don't believe in that. I believe in smaller government, and how we get that is through lower taxes. But what the issue here isn't about raising taxes or lowering taxes. The issue is about a tax shift. That's what's going on. Because we have levy limits in this state, which really is kind of sidebars for how much our municipalities can raise their taxes. And basically, it's net new construction is what how the levy in this our municipalities can increase. But what this does is that if one taxpayer pays less, or one group of taxpayers pay less, i.e. the dark store, people utilizing the dark store loophole, that means that somebody else has to pay more. And what happens is when these dark store loophole is invoked and these commercial properties utilize it to pay less real estate taxes, if this is how many real estate taxes you can be levying in a community, and commercial properties make up this much of it, well, now with the dark store loophole, it only make up this much of it, and less and less and less, and it's going to be more and more and more for the residential properties. And I'm not the one to pick winners and losers. That's not what I'm interested in. But when our statutes, really the intent of them is to state that we base our assessments on fair market value, And when our assessors cannot utilize their main tool to determine the fair market value of an income property, i.e. the income that's attributed to it, that's not fair. That needs to be fixed. And that's what policymakers like me and other people in Madison need to do. There was a flaw in the law that someone uncovered. Maybe it wasn't a flaw, but at least that's how a court determined it to be, to put us in the position that we are in today. And we as policymakers need to fix it. And that's what the dark store legislation is all about, that I've authored in the Senate, and I will continue to author in the Senate. I've not had success with it. We've come very, very, very close. Not quite there, but very close. Unfortunately, that doesn't matter until we get there. But there's some very powerful special interests that are fighting back against this. But I don't represent special interests. I represent everyone. And when this is a policy that is negatively affecting everyone, and it's not fair, and it's not right, it's something that we as policymakers need to fix. And so that's kind of a quick, not an overview, I would say, to give you a little background as to what the whole dark store issue is about and where we're going with it. And our fix is to clarify our statutes so that income of the real estate, again, has nothing to do with the business, has only to do with the lease value attributable to that property, but that income can at least be considered as a component in the valuation of that real estate. And again, there's two other components too. They all can be considered, but we can't just preclude one of them, income. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Gundrum.
I've always taken. Yep. No, I'm not. I've always taken the approach of a fair and equitable, tax structure, so that, as Senator Strobel referred to, the shift, it's heading more and more in the direction of the property owner, and that's not fair. When I was out campaigning, this issue would come up, and I had one gentleman that didn't think we should do anything because he was concerned the price of his hammers and paints that he would buy at a Menards would go through the roof to make up for the difference. But then when I explained to him, you have all these expenses that a retail operation needs, or services that are expenses for the municipality, such as fire calls, EMS calls, police responses. I asked him how many times he utilized those services at his home, and his answer was, well, none. So I said, okay, there's the difference. You're going to be picking up the tab because it's budgeted and estimated that going into a certain year, you're going to have this much in expense for fire, EMS, and police, and somebody has to make up the difference. It's not free, and it's not fair for us to be footing the bill as property owners, homeowners.
Thank you. Mayor Zdenico.
Thanks, Craig. Good morning, everybody. Number one, thanks to both Dewey and to Rick. I think it's probably pretty obvious, but if you don't know, they're really leading the fight, or part of the team that's leading the fight in Madison. Dewey's been doing it for a long time, since the inception of the loophole, or the discovery of the loophole, and Rick has certainly been doing it since he's elected, or been elected. Local guy, I know numbers can get a little, at least for me, a little confusing if I don't have them right in front of me, but I'm going to hit you with some numbers, some real world examples here in West Bend. We have two Walgreens stores, as you guys know. They were both built 9-10 years ago. And when they were built, according to public land sale records, plus the records of how much they said it was going to cost to build their building, according to their building permit, combined, they were $8 million. So remember, $8 million bucks. They both combined recently sold on the free market for $14 million. They're now being assessed less than $5 due to a lawsuit and due to the loophole. So according to their own records, $8 million cost, sold for 14, they're being assessed at 5. That $9 million gap, just for the West Bend School District itself, is over $70,000 a year, more than the equivalent of a full-time educator. Just one example. Our Menards, since it was built, it's been assessed generally around 10 million bucks. It started out in the mid 9s, and now it's in the low 10s. So just think about a $10 million assessment. They filed a lawsuit. They had an appraisal done that showed a $5 million value. The city had an appraisal done that showed a $15 million value. If you take the average of those two, Not surprisingly, the average is 10 million bucks, right where we have them assessed right now, not the $5 million that they're arguing for. And I think we'll talk about Menards a little bit later, Craig. Walmart, maybe the most egregious, assessed at $12 million. They, in 2006, put about $1.5 million worth of improvements into their building. They have filed a lawsuit claiming that they should be assessed $6 million. Again, half of this 50% seems to be a common number. What the craziest part is, if you pull it up on your phones right now and you Google Walmart's for sale, it is publicly listed for sale for $18 million. They're claiming it's worth $6 to us and to the government, but to the public, it's being claimed that it's worth 3 times that. Something's wrong. In speaking with our current assessor's office and prior assessors here at the city, as long as they can remember, there have been a handful of assessment challenges. There is a due process in place if you'd like to challenge your assessment. This year we had 0. Nobody in the city of West Bend, other than the big boxes, thought that West Bend did something incorrect on the assessment. Going back through history, it's usually a handful, 2, 3, or 4. Where our assessors may say you remodeled your basement and we think it cost 20 grand or it was worth 20 grand, and they may say it's 18. So we're negotiating and I'll say debating over relatively small amounts. 4 or 5 years ago, that world changed, and we're supposed to believe that it was a coincidence that it changed 4 or 5 years ago, that after 50, 60, 70, 100 years of assessing generally the same way, that out of the blue, the big box decided that coincidentally they're all going to come forward and file dozens, if not hundreds, of lawsuits around Wisconsin. It's not a coincidence. It didn't just happen by accident. What just happened was they just found the loophole. And similar to what Dewey mentioned, I don't fault the businesses for exploiting the loophole. They have a responsibility to their organizations, to their employees, in many cases to their shareholders, to use the law as they interpret it for the benefit of their organization. What I fault right now, after these guys putting their heads down and fighting in Madison, I fault, I'll say especially the Assembly leadership, for not bringing this to the floor. There are enough votes. Many of the people in the room, including myself, testified, I think it's 2 years ago. There were enough votes 2 years ago to pass it. What might be unsavory to some is that to pass it, this is going to take some people with a R next to their name and some people with a D next to their name. And that frustrates me. So I'd call on these guys to keep doing exactly what they're doing, but also, especially on Assembly leadership, to do a gut check and not just do what is fun politically, but really govern the way you should be governing. The 3 examples I laid out here, again, we can get into as much detail as you want. It's a loophole that simply needs to be closed. Congratulations for them for identifying it when they did. We just need to make a change.
Thank you. I guess one of the first questions I would ask of the mayor is, I know that you are presently in a couple of lawsuits, and they have been challenging. Representative Gundrum hit on a topic that I think that needs to be considered as part of this, and the fact that when you look at the average small business up or down downtown area or along Main Street, they don't ever see police or fire or ambulance. And yet, when you look at some of these big box stores, 2 or 3 times a day, perhaps a police officer is in there. There's probably a fireman in there every so often, and certainly they need their roads taken care of. There's all these issues, and the infrastructure of one of them is so significant as compared to other businesses in our community. So they don't want to pay for that, and that's part of what they pay as part of their assessment. Isn't that correct?
Correct, and it's hard to monetize that. You know, the conversation Rick had with his constituent about being concerned that the cost of a hammer was going to go up. I think you had a great explanation, but it's hard to describe how is this, if dark store really goes south, how will this really affect us? It's definitely going to affect the amount of taxes our homeowners and small businesses pay, no doubt about it. Will it be insurmountable? I guess that depends on how you define it. What it will do is make communities like West Bend and primarily Washington County, pretty conservative communities who really resist raising taxes, it'll make them look first at cutting other things. We can all giggle about the roads in West Bend. We're pretty proud of the work that we're doing, but that's where the dollars are going to start to come from. To answer your question regarding services, Meijer and Walmart are both open 24 hours. Most places, most retailers are not open 24 hours. So it's really the late night calls that are a major effect, that if you're out at 3 o'clock in the morning, you've got a select few places to go, you're going to one of those two big boxes. If there's an issue, very often it is, I don't have our police statistics in front of me, but they're pretty astounding how many calls are made, and I think you probably underestimated some of those, Craig. Mm-hmm. They're made late night, they're made when we have a thinner staff, whether it's primarily police, thinner staff on, and they're concentrated in these big boxes because they're the 24-hour chain. So you're exactly right. It's a significant impact on services. So they want to reduce the amount that they contribute to operating municipalities, and at the same time they're gobbling up, I would argue, more than their fair share of services.
Senator, you were talking about that there are powerful interests out there. I'll be the one that say it. Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, who, by the way, also is the parent organization for Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce executives. So I've been running kind of afoul of my friends in Madison because I'm passionate about this subject, and they're basically trying to bury it and not have anybody really paying attention to it. But from what I understand, they have been one of the major reasons why the loophole hasn't been closed. Is that correct?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Oftentimes, I agree with the WMC. I think they're right on many issues, but this one they're dead wrong on, and I've told them that. But unfortunately, they're very influential in Madison, as many special interests are throughout the spectrum, and but again, you need to govern on what's best for everyone in this state, and not just what's best for one special interest. And this law has to change.
Mm-hmm. Representative Gundrum, I know you went through the listening session that was a joint Senate Assembly session. I watched I think 8 hours of it on my computer. While a lot of it was sort of posturing, there also were a lot of things that came out of it that were really shocking. One was that Shannon Krause, who used to be our assessor and is now the assessor down in Wauwatosa, said that they have already spent over $1 million in legal fees trying to fight against the big box stores on this issue. What was your take coming out of that session that you had?
Excuse me. Yes, Wauwatosa, we'll use as an example, they have a lot of lawsuits that they're involved in, and they have deeper pockets, for lack of a better term, than, say, a smaller municipality, even a West Bend or smaller, where negotiations take place, negotiating the new assessed value. Just because other municipalities don't want to take it to the courts, because if they lose, they really lose. So, but in essence, they're losing because they just, for lack of a better term, a lot of communities cave because they just don't have the financial resources to fight it. So, I was surprised. I think also in that hearing it was mentioned, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but if the city of Wauwatosa took their commercial and other properties and cut the values in half, the assessed values in half, the slack obviously would be picked up by the homeowners, but the increase in personal property tax for a homeowner would be astronomical. And that's the road that this is heading down, and we need to stop that. And so out of that study commission, we did pass out 3 bills that some seem to think we've cured the problem. We haven't, but it's a Band-Aid, but it created some useful tools for both communities getting involved in negotiations and also for assessing. And one of the bills, I'll just run through them real quick here, allowing taxing jurisdictions to form cost-sharing agreements to help cover the cost assessments. So because of the high costs of defending an appeal, To better help out, you could create like a 4-member, 5-member committee from each taxing jurisdiction in your community. That would involve county, schools, municipality, technical colleges. And then the intent is to have all the stakeholders share on the costs and the litigation, provide more financial resources, and it would require a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 majority before proceeding one way or the other. The other one is the financial information disclosure, and that allows assessors easier access to documents for complete financial information on certain property before completing the assessments. Now, if these documents are not provided before open book, the taxpayer can't appeal the assessment. The assessment can be used in the court case, but no new evidence can be entered in from either side. That's what the court case would be evolving around, just that information. Also establishing uniform timeliness and procedures for an objection to a property tax assessment by eliminating some of the confusion that currently exists in the courts. Taxpayer can bring court action for excessive assessment without filing a claim with the taxing jurisdiction. The taxpayers must file an appeal within 90 days. That speeds up the process. Other items addressed to speed up the process would be saving on interest reimbursements for municipalities, and it would shorten up the length. On average, I believe it's something like 18 months to complete a case. And from what I understand, the mayor can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in the middle of one court proceeding and another one starts, and so you're just in a continual.
Yep.
You don't get anything wrapped up in time to move on. So
I'd like to just follow up on that a little bit. I very much appreciate the work Rick did on that committee and so on. He had a really tough job because, as I said, there's special interests very much involved in this process. Those things have good intent, and I think that they'll help a little bit around the edges, but we're really not going to fix this problem until we allow the income component of a property to be considered in the valuation of that property. That's really the only way we're going to ultimately fix this problem. And I find it a little ironic, and I know, like I said, Rick did great work on this thing, that one of the ways to fix it is to allow municipalities to band together so they can spend more money defending these things. Mm-hmm. To me, I'm not interested in spending more taxpayer resources to deal with a problem that we should be fixing in Madison. You know, it's a Band-Aid, and it gives us more flexibility and a little bit of improvement to the situation. But really, in the end, that's not the solution that we need to get this job fixed.
I'd just like to add that I was the only one on the committee that voted against that, because I saw what you're mentioning, also the chance to mess with the levy formula, and I thought, now we've created another loophole. But knowing that it was probably going to pass, I put in the piece that said it's got to be a supermajority to pass, so that you wouldn't.
And
see
I understand we're in a better place because of it, but we're about 5% there, another 95% to go.
Mm-hmm. Mayor, with the suits that the city has been facing here in West Bend, not only are they asking to have their taxes reduced, but they're asking to get their money back from past years. And I guess a question I would have is, where does the city or the county or the school district come up with 40, 50, 60,000 or more for each year where it's already been utilized, and they're scraping by as it is right now?
Comes from the pothole fund. Comes from doing other services around the community that certainly have a higher priority. You're exactly right. The Menard suit was looking for the city and all the taxing entities back to 2000. I believe our lawsuit was for 16, 17, and 18. So pay back reimbursements back to them to the tune of $250,000 or so. And again, it's another educator, if you like to put it in terms of what does this mean to an individual person. It's the equivalent of a full-time educator. I will say that there's been a couple of chinks in the armor when it comes to these big box. Very expensive, as the guys have talked about. But in April of this year, Village of Plover won a lawsuit against Lowe's, which I don't know if that was the first, but it was among the first. Nobody has figured out a way to get Menards to back down until Wednesday of this week, when Menards officially pulled, I guess it's not the legal term, pulled their lawsuit against the city of West Bend. Some of you in the room may be familiar with it. It's pretty awesome. The council met in closed session, to debate our legal decision several times. They can't get into too much detail, but suffice it to say, city staff, our legal team, and the council ultimately decided to stare the line in the eyes and say, if you really think that you're going to win in court, that your building is worth $5 million, then bring it on. We were supposed to enter a week-long court hearing, litigation, starting June 10th, and again, just this week, we found out that they're pulling their lawsuit. So it's a great victory, I think, for the cause. It's a great victory for other communities. I hope to do the same thing and stare the line in the eyes if they can afford to hold out long enough to do so. And it tells me that these retailers recognize that maybe their day has come, and I'm hoping that means, I believe that a law change has to start in the assembly. Is that, do I have that?
It starts in either house. In fact,
Either house,
this
okay.
law, the fix to the dark store loophole passed the committee in the Senate last session. So it's been voted, it's been aired, and so on, but it unfortunately didn't make it to the floor in the Senate. And as far as the assembly, it's never made it out of committee yet. So
These guys can be polite because they work with these, these two cases, gentlemen, every day. I don't have to be quite as polite. I think it's baloney that it's not getting to the floor. And pass it along to the boys, if you would. Because they've got ours next to their name, and many of you know that so do I. But I just think it's ridiculous that you're putting communities throughout the state through this. These lawsuits are not happening. I think it's important to note in every state around the country. There are fixes out there. What is it, a dozen states or so are kind of have the crosshairs on them. Might be a couple more, might be a couple less. The votes are there. I believe there are enough actually co-sponsors to the legislation to pass the bills. It is just not getting to the assembly floor or to the floor of the Senate.
Senator, Representative, how long would it take, assuming, do the bills that were in the last session, they're dead and you have to start all over again? Is that basically, or do you use it as a template to move forward?
I've reintroduced the bill this year, and it's essentially the same bill from last session because we had a lot of strong buy-in on it. There's no reason to change it. The bill's been thoroughly researched and vetted. It's just a matter of getting the votes, and again, I'm the author of it, and we're back at it hard again this session to get it done.
I've noticed, too, the people that have signed on are from both sides of the aisle. It's bipartisan support, and that's encouraging. Again, we need to keep moving forward and pushing, and eventually maybe we can make progress on this. It's something that's well needed. So
I understand that many of these suits are going forward not necessarily because the corporate entity of the big box store is actually driving it through their lawyers, but because there are attorneys that are kind of freelancing and offering their services. If they win, they get a chunk of the reward, and if they lose, the big box store doesn't pay anything. Is that pretty much accurate?
Yeah. There's appraisers out here who specialize in this, in exploiting this loophole, and they do exactly as you said. They'll go to the owner and they'll say, "Hey, if I can get your real estate taxes reduced, I'd like a cut of them, and you got nothing to lose if you don't." And that's the mechanism that they use, because they know oftentimes City Hall doesn't have the time or resources to fight these things. And we understand as far as retail goes, which is only one component that utilizes this dark store theory. There's other types of real estate that do, but we understand with retail that the pressures of the internet and the trends that consumers have, and that impacts the values of properties, no question. But that's not what's at play here. What's at play here is the whole component of not being able to look at the income component of an income property. Property values go up and down all the time. I mean, that's just the reality of the marketplace But again, this is a loophole that's creating an inequity that needs to be fixed.
Craig, if I can touch on one
Sure.
sort of offshoot of that regarding process and municipalities not having necessarily the wherewithal. What I believe all in West Bend, and I'll say most throughout the state, when these lawsuits are filed, the attorneys file to circumvent the process that's already in place. We have volunteers, maybe some of you in the room are on our Board of Appeals. They file to circumvent that local process, presumably so they don't have to air their dirty laundry to the people that are actually shopping down the street at their stores, and file and have been successful in going directly into litigation. So, not that our Board of Appeals, is the be-all, end-all, because the lawsuit very likely may have continued even if the Board of Appeals sided with the assessors. But because they have deeper pockets, the Joe homeowner isn't taking his basement reassessment to the Supreme Court, whereas these guys are able to skip a step and go right into litigation.
About 6 months ago, you and City Administrator Shambo and myself met with Kurt Bauer and Corey Fish from Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce out. Randy Weber at Daco Precision hosted our meeting, and there was a lot of very spirited discussion around the table. It was sort of thought that maybe we had made some progress and perhaps had been able to argue favorably that maybe their position was maybe the wrong position. Have you heard anything back from them, either directly or indirectly, since that meeting?
No, who I've heard from is Randy Weber, and many of you guys know him. He was, and I think still is, dumbfounded. He credits the WMC for helping mentor him 20, 25 years ago in starting his business. He credits that organization with nurturing him, and I think he even used the term being a part-time psychiatrist as he was growing his business and going through the ups and downs, and he just can't figure out how he's sitting at the table with the same organization that helped him so much, and he's 180 degrees opposite of that line of thinking, to the point that he's really challenged the city, and I think we've done it, lived up to the challenge, especially with the Menards victory, I hope, in showing that we're not out there raising taxes as these guys touched on. This isn't raising anything. There's never been a talk of raising taxes. It's really keeping the status quo that's been in existence for decades and decades. But it's folks like Randy. He didn't understand it exactly, to his credit and to your credits. You're here trying to get smart on the topic. And like I say, he just can't believe it. And I think the more Randy Webers out there that understand this and can start putting some pressure on, the term grassroots is overused right now, but that's what has to happen with a topic like this.
Well, as far as Wisconsin in general, a lot of these small communities maybe only have one big box store. But if they lose that income, it's going to put them way behind the eight ball as they go forward. WMC has used this rhetoric of, there are rogue assessors out, I guess in the dark of night with torches and hoods are out changing assessments upward, and yet certainly in West Bend that has not been the case, and I would assume, Senator or Representative, that you have not heard of that on a broad basis across the state.
Certainly not on a broad basis, but there are situations where properties are inaccurately assessed. I mean, it can happen, but there's a process to deal with that. But we're not talking about that right now. Again, we're talking about a systemic problem in the statute that allows this loophole to occur. So.
Okay. I don't know if there's any questions from the floor.
Yeah, so who's blocking this? Is it Fitzgerald and Voss?
I can answer that so you guys don't have to. The question was, who's blocking it? Is it Senator Fitzgerald or Assemblyman Voss? Go ahead if you.
Well, I'll tell you this, it's advanced further in the Senate than it has in the Assembly. And so I would tell you that the main block there, I think as the mayor had mentioned previously, is the Assembly. And typically leadership in the Assembly has a lot to do with what happens there.
And then what can we as homeowners do to try to advance the process?
You could contact Assembly leadership and Senate leadership. and let them, whether they, even though they don't specifically represent you, I mean, I represent this area, but as leaders of those bodies, they represent all of us. You have every right to call those offices and let your opinion be voiced as to what you think is right on this issue, and I'd encourage you to do it.
I'll say that, go ahead.
Okay. Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah. I echo those same sentiments. I was listening to Steve Scafidi the other day, and he started talking about this dark store issue, and he said that if leadership doesn't wake up, they might find themselves out of a job because the taxpayers are not going to just sit back on their hands. They're going to do something about it. And he was giving a little heads up, warning type message. So things like that, I think, might help move things forward too.
Follow the money. Every single county that had a referendum on this topic passed. Every single county. I don't remember how many it was. Was it half the counties in the state, give or take? Everyone passed. The state has spoken. The left and the right have spoken, and it's a couple guys or a guy with some earmuffs on that's holding us up.
Okay, maybe we'll, if there are no other questions, oh, there's one more.
I am Representative Timothy Rampton from the 59th Assembly. I came today.
Yeah.
Okay. I am Representative Timothy Rampton from the 59th Assembly. I came today to be educated by these fine and intelligent gentlemen, and I can tell you that I am. Thank you very much for your presentation. Your data was spot on, and I was on the bill already, but now I'm going to champion it further. My question is, Ways and Means is the committee where this bill resides within the Assembly? Has it been assigned to Ways and Means? Historically, I think
I've
it was.
heard a couple potential
Okay.
committees.
Well, I'm on Ways and Means, and when I leave this building today, I'm going to be reaching out to the chairman to ask that this bill be on the next agenda to get immediate attention, and I will, on behalf of my respected colleagues, push leadership today as well to get this thing greased. I'm a big proponent to help make this happen. I'm relatively new to the seat, but I've been educated before today, but mostly today. So I want to personally thank you all for having this today and to make a difference, and I'll do what I can to work with you gentlemen to make it come to fruition. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
There are no other questions. Maybe each of you would like to have some closing remarks on this?
Sure. Yeah, I'll make the
Senator?
closing.
Yep.
Yes. Again, this, and it's been said before, I just want to repeat it because this is the talking point the opposition uses. This is about raising taxes, is what they say. This is not about raising taxes. That's not the type of thing I stand for. What this is about is it's about equity and fairness in our assessment system for real estate taxation. It's about righting a wrong in the statute that needs to be fixed. It's not about picking winners and losers. It's about sticking to what our really Constitution says about fairness and taxation. And we tax on the basis of that's our assessments are based upon the fair market value of a property. And if you can't use the proper method to determine the fair market value of a property, you can't have an accurate assessment. And if you don't have an accurate assessment, you're not going to have a fair taxation, real estate taxation system. It really all comes down to that.
Representative Gundrum?
Again, fairness, equity, and I will keep pushing and fighting for the homeowners, property owners, so that they're not getting the bulk of the tax assessments shifted over to them.
Mayor Sedanico.
Enough votes exist to close this loophole both in the Assembly and the Senate. I would call on Robin Voss, the Assembly leader. He's doing a great job of playing politics. In my opinion, he's doing a poor job of governing. So, Tim, thanks for coming and getting on board. And guys, please keep up the good work. And honestly, anybody in the room that can reach out, in my humble opinion, get it to the floor of both of these houses and let's see how the votes fall. But to shield it and block it like I will say Robin Voss is doing right now, it's just really distasteful to me. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. I have to say that very grateful that all three of you came out to speak on the subject. As I said in my opening comments, this is a cancer. People in Wisconsin, for the most part, don't know about it, and there are a lot of folks out there trying to keep it from the residents. And yet, there's no reason, if this were to continue, that I could not claim that my home should be measured as a dark store home. And while I'm in the center of West Bend, some building that's abandoned and outside the city is being assessed at a much lower rate, then why should my home not be assessed that way? So, the chamber has to step in on things like this. We cannot sit on the sidelines and ignore it, because this has a huge impact, not only in this community, but communities around the state. So thank you again. Appreciate everyone that's come out today to hear them.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good day.